Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and once again it is time for the Monday Q&As. I'm going to try to knock these out today, but I'm still tired and hurting. I had a long night last night, only got about 3 hours of sleep, but I had a fantastic time party. But let's knock these out. First question. All negatives and all positives of having a chronic low-fat diet, 30 to 40 grams a day for 6+ months. Okay, this really depends. Now, if you're on exogenous hormones, for example, you can get away with these really low-fat diets for extended periods of time. You might get some vitamin deficiencies, you might get some essential fatty acid deficiencies in the long term if you're not supplementing the right things or your diet isn't really balanced. However, you're unlikely to see real negative effects, and in that case, you're going to end up with pretty good body composition probably as a result of it, unless your calories are just too high. It's a good way to recomposition for people in that situation, or at least minimize fat gain in a large calorie surplus. Now, that's true to some extent as well for people who are completely drug-free and clean. However, the issue is that doing this for prolonged periods of time, you are very, very likely to start having issues with hormonal deficiencies, potentially if you're not careful. Your body may produce certain hormones, particularly your sex hormones, I think, at a much, much lower rate as a result of it. So it is something that you need to be aware of, be cautious of, but it is very, very good for body composition purposes. And if you're in a calorie surplus, you're far less likely to run into those negatives. But when you start going into a calorie deficit, it can become a problem. But it is probably one of the better ways to be in a calorie surplus with less fat gain, but just be aware that in a worst case scenario, even in that scenario, you may see some reduction in things like sex hormone production. And that could affect you in the long term. All right, next question. Your thoughts about George Leeman. All right, I really like George Leeman. I don't always agree with everything George says. In fact, I think a lot of what George says is incorrect, and it doesn't mean just because he's been successful that everything he says is going to be right. A lot of it just isn't biomechanically correct. However, he does give a lot of good advice. What I like about George is he is very inspirational. He inspires people to do better, and he's probably one of the more genetically gifted and very possibly one of the hardest training strength athletes out there. So no matter what you may or may not agree with on his philosophies and training philosophies in particular, I don't think anyone who's observed him who doesn't have a tremendous amount of respect for his work ethic, because his work ethic is just mind-bogglingly insane. And I think that is the biggest secret to George's success, good genetics, and he just out-trains and trains harder than anybody else. And that makes a big difference in the grand scheme of things. And most of us just can't compete with George on that level. So he gets nothing but respect from me, even though I may disagree with some things he says biomechanically. When you train as hard as he does and have good genetics, you can probably get away with a lot of things and still see amazing results. All right, next question. How popular are beta blockers in professional sports, and do they test for them? I really have no idea if they're testing for beta blockers these days. However, are they common in sports? Oh yeah, any sport that requires concentration, focus, staying calm, whether it's actual physical sports or even mental sports. A lot of pro gamers use them, professional chess players, all sorts of other endeavors. Beta blockers are actually quite effective. They're very heavily used in a variety of performance applications, so just a wide variety of endeavors. As far as testing for them, I actually really and truly don't know, though. I'm not up to speed on that. I apologize for that. I know I'm supposed to be one of the guys who knows a lot about drug testing, but most of my knowledge is coming from a previous generation. I'm not always up to speed on what's going on today in 2015, so I apologize for that. All right. Next question. Jason, I am a nurse who works 3 13-hour night shifts per week, Sunday, Monday, Wednesdays, and train the other 4 days. I try to sleep as much as I can normally, but I find I am still usually fatigued at my baseline. In what ways does working nights hinder your progress pursuing strength-based goals? For example, increased cortisol levels and reduced recovery time. Okay, honestly, night shift work, doing shift work like that does have a lot of effect on cortisol. It has been shown to have negative effects on your overall body chemistry. It isn't healthy, but a lot of people have to do it for their careers. It is what it is. Now, accordingly, because of those various shifts in hormones like stress hormones and other things in the body, yes, it can negatively affect your recovery and negatively affect your gains. Is it going to bring them to a standstill? No, of course not, but it's reasonable to assume it is going to have some negative effects. And it isn't a good idea for overall health to do shift work in the long term, just if you want to live to be healthy and have a nice, long, healthy life. It's just not the best of ideas. But again, when you're doing nursing and other things, that's one of the jobs that actually requires some people out there to have to do it, so what are you going to do? But, you know, it's not the be-all, end-all. It's not like you're not going to make gains as long as everything else is in order. You're getting the rest, the training, stimulus, and nutrition. You're still going to make good gains. It's just they may not be the best that you could possibly make. So it just is what it is. All right, next question. Yo, Mr. Blaha, I really struggle with repping deadlifts. After 5 to 6 reps, my form breaks down and it generally kills me. For quite a large range of weights. In fact, the estimated 1 rep max from the 5 rep max calculator is about 35 kilograms lower than my actual 1 rep max. Any idea what the issues could be? You know, deadlifts are a unique animal. They're one of those lifts that you really fatigue easily on. Your central nervous system fatigues. Form tends to degrade very, very easily. Now, the form degradation is usually the issue. What I recommend if you're doing rep work on the deadlifts, don't do touch and go stuff if you wanted to keep the form good and the strength up. What you need to do is take a break between every single rep. Like if you're doing a 10 rep set on deadlifts, it's probably not a bad idea for you to go ahead and take 2 or 3 seconds to fully reset and recover between each rep so that you can focus on making sure every single rep is perfect and good, because usually there starts to be problems when the form degrades from rushing it and you start losing focus due to fatigue, particularly all the various support muscles, your central nervous system, everything else just kind of sputtering out a bit. So really just take your time with rep work on deadlifts would be my recommendation so that you can make sure you fully reset and are focused on each and every rep that you do, and that'll generally help you with this problem. Alright, next question. Thoughts on carb loading post-workout while cutting? Not a bad idea. In fact, if you're on limited calories because you're cutting and limited carbs, it is a generally wise idea to time most of your carbohydrate intake around your training, whether it's pre-workout for improved glycogen storage for training or post-workout for better recovery. It isn't a bad idea. People will say, well, the timing doesn't matter that much. It's true, timing doesn't matter that much. But if someone's trying to glean just a little bit of an edge, and they want to mess with timing, that is generally the direction I would push them in if they want to time these things. Just remember though that meal timing for everyone but the really hard training athletes is going to have a very, very small effect. So it's not going to be a night and day difference, but it can be a very small difference if you do that. So it's certainly not a bad idea if it fits within your lifestyle and goals. And it's certainly not something that I would have a problem with, of course. It isn't a bad idea at all. It can help a little bit. All right, next question. Volume or intensity for muscle hypertrophy, which matters more? Well, the thing is, I hate these things when people say which matters more when we know both are absolutely factors. It's not like you can only focus on one or the other and expect to make really, really good progress in hypertrophy. However, that being said, if you had to increase one in the short term, for most people genetically, the volume is going to do a little more for hypertrophy than the intensity once you have kind of come out of the noob stage. Or if you have aren't using a really large amount of volume and you've got your strength level built up from your base. Early on for the novice, just the sheer intensity, increasing the weight on the bar is going to do a lot. For a lot of people, genetically, the majority adding volume beyond that threshold, for people who've been training for a while, is generally going to do a little more there. But the thing to keep in mind is that you do have a large genetic component involved. Not everyone genetically responds to one better than the other. Just there's a larger bias towards a bit more volume. And there's also an experience level to consider of how far developed you are. So those are both factors. So you're kind of still looking at a situation to where in different situations it can be one or the other. So just try to keep that in mind with that. All right, next question. What's your take on slow reps? It's very common in Scandinavian powerlifting. Even the very successful Norwegian powerlifting team use them. Thanks, Jason. I'm just not a fan of slow reps. There's no reason to think that slow reps are necessarily going to help you build more strength and power. Specificity of training, you should always be seeking to move a weight as fast as you can and explosively as you can if you want to be stronger and more explosive. The fact that someone is using a method who is successful doesn't always mean that that method is the reason for their success, and that's something to keep in mind. It is very possible for someone to have a method involved that isn't effective as long as the rest of their training is geared in the right direction. They're training hard enough, sufficient stimulus, sufficient recovery, and enough progression consistently. It is very possible for someone to make fantastic gains while still having something completely wrong. So you can't always use that as evidence, and I just don't see any reason for someone to intentionally do slow reps who wants to get stronger and faster and more explosive. It's just not ideal. And in many cases it can be counterproductive. But that's something that we could argue till we're blue in the face. And again, just remember though, that just because someone has used something successfully doesn't mean that they're successful. Because of that factor, they could be successful in spite of it. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time in part 2.